Why is the Irish far-right growing, and is there any truth to anything they believe? It's been claimed that 100,000 people turned out to march against immigration in Dublin City over the Easter weekend. This is found to be false. Headcount aside, this march was unprecedented in scale and marked a significant chapter in the growth of the far-right in Ireland. So, where did these people come from? Before we go any further, let's establish some facts. It is true that Ireland is seeing an unprecedented increase in arrivals of asylum seekers. These people are not part of a conspiracy to replace the native Irish population. They're fleeing war, famine, persecution, all of which are things that the native Irish population should be attuned to, given our history of being victims of colonisation and oppression. It is true that there's pressure being placed on services across the country in some way due to the influx of migrants, be they asylum seekers, people arriving here from neighbouring countries seeking work, or Irish people returning to Ireland. But there's been strain on public services in Ireland for at least the last 10 years, thanks to the policies of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael since the 2008 financial crash. If we're being honest, both parties have failed to invest adequately in cities, towns and villages across the country since we took the Union Jack off Dublin Castle. It is true that it can be a shock for people living in small towns and villages to have a large population of asylum seekers arrive in their community from one day to the next without little notice or consultation from those in power. Again, this is the failure of governing parties and local authorities to plan adequately, not particularly for an influx of asylum seekers, but for the growth of towns and villages nationwide. Ireland's a country of immigrants, and the lack of infrastructure to accommodate people in rural communities is a prime reason for us being this. Successive governments have willfully neglected communities like Roscrea, Liston Varna, or any other town you've heard on the lips of Twitter citizen journalists in recent years. We're now living in a period where the mismanagement of the state for the last 100 years is on full display. And instead of the blame being placed on the powers that be, it's being placed on those dealt the worst hand of all. Ireland isn't full. Ireland's been failed by the political parties that have dominated the state for the last 100 years, and the most marginalised in society are being blamed for their incompetence in a bid to keep the rich rich and the not rich divided. The Irish political classes have neglected the working classes for at least the last 20 years. The most intense and affronting crisis in the state's modern history, the housing crisis, has been allowed to fester to the present moment where homelessness is at its highest rate ever, and any new housing stock has been offered up at the altar of vulture capitalism and kept well out of reach of the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, of people waiting to move out of their parents' spare room or out of their landlord's broom cupboard. One argument of the Irish far-right is that Ireland should be housing our own before we house refugees. This point goes further to demonstrate the failures of the Irish government well before any large-scale arrival of refugees to the country. Dara Adelaide is a People Before Profit councillor in South Dublin County Council. He points out that there is and has been ample opportunity to house Irish people long before the large-scale arrival of asylum seekers to the country.
There's 166,000 empty homes across Ireland. I think 50,000 of them have been empty for more than 6 years. There's a lot of public land that hasn't been used that could be used to build housing. I think the problem is we have a housing system that's really set up to make a lot of profit for a small number of people, whether that's investment funds or landlords or letting agents, and the government is unwilling to touch it. They're unwilling to tackle the vulture funds or to tackle dereliction. All these things would bring the cost of rent down, bring the cost of housing down, and I think it's maybe wrong, although I understand why people are angry, that blame doesn't lie with asylum seekers. And they're not taking up housing, they're being put in old office blocks and living in tents in the city centre. The problem really isn't refugees, it's not asylum seekers, it's not migration, it's this sort of economic system that we have that's set up to benefit just the wealthy, just the property owners, just the investment funds. Yeah, I think, right, when you're faced with scarcity, it's a lot easier to believe, because I mean the people on the boardrooms of these investment funds aren't walking around our towns and stuff like that. You need someone to blame, and a much easier target is the person below you on the ladder, the person who came in just after you. And I think far-right agitators have used that extremely effectively to tell people, listen, you're on the housing list for this long, the reason is, these people who are coming in. Whereas in reality, I mean, back in the 60s when the country had no money whatsoever, we built so much social housing, we built it directly through the councils. Ireland's now one of the richest countries ever, and we don't do that. There's political decisions that are being made. They're not being made by immigrants or asylum seekers, they're being made by people with a lot of political and economic power.
For decades now, the government has been paying hoteliers across the country to put families up in their vacant rooms, rather than building houses for those who need it. This policy has now been extended to refugees, where in some cases, the government has given hoteliers the chance to fill their entire premises with asylum seekers in the quiet season at the behest of the Irish taxpayer. It's not the fault of refugees that this is the system that the Irish government deploys as a response to the housing and refugee crises. Social Democrats' Rory Hearn breaks down the policy.
We have a housing crisis because we've had governments over the last 40 years who failed to build social and affordable housing on any sufficient scale. They handed housing to the market. We go back to the Celtic Tiger years, the 1990s, 2000s, when there was a massive boom in housing, but it was all pumped by banks. There was a huge amount of properties were bought as buy-to-lets, they were bought as investment assets, and then there was a huge crash because of that and the wider global financial crisis. And then that crash destroyed the country. And the biggest reason we're in a housing crisis is two things. One was the government's response to that crash was to bring in vulture funds in here to buy up loads of properties and to really hand over our housing to them. They saw them as the future, build to rent. You know, the young people would be happy to live in rental housing. And the other thing was they stopped building social housing, stopped building any public affordable housing. And those two things created this, on the one hand, a generation who have been forced to rent, pay incredibly unaffordable rents, and other people just left behind, not able to access affordable housing, not able to access social housing. A question people ask, they go, well, why, have Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who've been in power since the foundation of the state, they have been in every single government, has been either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael leading it. Why haven't they solved it when we know we have a housing emergency for over a decade? And it's because their policies actually caused the crisis. Their very policies were about bringing in vulture funds into here. They were about, and part of why that's so important is because they saw the main supply of housing coming from these institutional investors. And one of the key things that they saw, well, to incentivize those guys to come in here, we're not going to control rents. So they brought in limited forms of rent control. Initially, before 2016, no rent controls, then said, well, we'll put a 4% limit, and then brought down to 2%, but they've never enforced them properly. And we have, the rent caps in place, the rent pressure zones. They're not in here to build affordable housing or provide affordable housing. They're not charities. They're not charities. They are super big corporations who want to maximize what they can make from basically screwing a generation from rents. And it is not an exaggeration to say that these funds want a generation to be stuck renting, because you are their product, you are their commodity, you are what they want to make money from. And so part of government policy has been to promote them and not to build affordable housing, which would give people an alternative. They essentially have handed, particularly in Dublin, the market over to these big institutional investors.
Ireland's housing crisis is one of the most tragic situations to ever be put on the people. Since 2008, successive governments, led by either one of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, have failed to provide the most basic necessities to the Irish people, key among them being housing.
Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael made decisions to suit investor funds, to suit banks, to suit big developers and people who own property. They were not concerned about the generation coming behind. And that is the most frustrating thing about this whole anti-immigration stuff and this whole, we're blaming immigrants for the housing crisis or blaming refugees. It is government policy that has caused this housing crisis. It has been Irish landlords who've evicted thousands of people into homelessness, not refugees, not immigrants. It has been Irish landlords, it has been Irish governments who have failed to build social and affordable housing. And it's really disingenuous and purposely disingenuous of the far right and those people to be blaming immigrants and refugees for the housing crisis when actually the cause is completely different. And one of the most frustrating things of all of this is who benefits from the growth in the far right, and the rise of that is the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who, because the left is attacked, the left is blamed for standing up for and standing with refugees, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael get back into power again.
Any attempt to alleviate the housing crisis has only exacerbated it. Ministers have been and gone parroting lines such as,
I want more landlords. I want more private landlords, particularly small ones, to decide to become landlords in the future, to increase the supply of rental accommodation. And it becomes really hard to try and get somebody to become a landlord if you're saying to them, under no circumstances can you ever do anything different with your property.
And claims that calling faceless piles of cash, capitalising on the misery of a generation of Irish people, vulture funds, might hurt somebody's feelings. In a country where over 100,000 properties are vacant or derelict, and 15,000 people being homeless in the country, Ireland's housing crisis should have been solved long before a refugee crisis became a talking point. Before the 2024 general election, immigration was fourth on a list of priorities for Irish people, on a mere 7%. Guess what was the highest priority? The most recent radicalising force in Irish and global politics was the COVID-19 pandemic. In Ireland, the ground was prepared for the growth of a visible far-right movement during the years of lockdown, through a healthy diet of hysteria and misinformation. Ireland had one of the most stringent lockdown policies in Europe during the pandemic. The isolation and idleness many were plunged into during this period gave a fantastic opportunity to quote-unquote news sites and conspiracy theorists to burrow into the nation's social fabric and spread all sorts of nonsense. Several prominent figures in Ireland drank the Kool-Aid of COVID misinformation, including ex-MMA fighter Paddy Holohan and TV financial advisor Eddie Hobbs. Online hysteria about lockdowns and the pandemic in general manifested in several protests across the country and showed for the first time the scale of support for fringe, factually questionable theories. Radicalising factors during the pandemic were not just about whether there were microchips in the vaccines. As Ireland continued to welcome international protection applicants, theories swirled over their arrival and presence in towns and villages previously unreached by any outside culture or creed. So, to the meat. The very mission statement of the Irish far-right is false. Ireland isn't full. Ireland is one of the only countries in the world whose population has decreased in the last 200 years. There were over 1 million more people living on the island in the 1840s than there are now. The small matter of the systemic starvation of the native Irish population was much to do with that. Ireland also has one of the lowest population densities, not only in Europe, but the world. The country is underpopulated, under-resourced, and rural communities have been underserved for generations, before we even get into the lack of investment in infrastructure in towns and cities across the country. What the Irish far-right have latched onto is a feeling that the majority of Irish people have been forgotten by the government. The movement point to forgotten towns, people left to rot by the state, and refugees, quote-unquote, shipped in to overwhelm and replace the local population. Roscrea is often used as a case study by the likes of Conor McGregor to prove their claims of mass takeovers of rural Ireland. The reality on the ground couldn't be further from the truth. We went to Roscrea shortly after a far-right element took over a community-led protest against asylum seekers being housed in the local area.
Now, there was far-right groups brought down from different places, and we'd ask them to leave. Local women and men asked him to leave. We don't want any part of that. And then for that minister to go on and say that he reported to the guards, and then he ran to social media with it, of course he did, straight away, to say that we wanted to set fire to the hotel. What good is a burnt down hotel? We were there to fight for our hotel. It was absolutely just an absolute joke. Looking for Browning pints, I suppose. I don't know what he was up to, but to say that he done that now, he's finished. He committed political suicide, in my opinion. It was absolutely atrocious. Not about race. I have mixed race children. And I've been called racist, I've been called all sorts. I don't care. I'm standing up for my town. We've had enough. We're left to think, what's this, a dumping ground? It's been put down last year, the year before there, as a disadvantaged town. So here, the government sees that, here, just throw them in there. With no idea of what's going to happen, the consequences down the road. It's crazy.
My friends have lost their jobs and they were only told through Tip FM on the Thursday morning.
That's how they found out?
That's how they found out, and the managers didn't even know, it was just the owners that knew, so no one was actually known about losing their jobs, only through the news, That was really it.
There was no dialogue whatsoever. We got the call that the bus was coming, and as the bus was coming up the road, that's when, out of nowhere, the guards from Dublin came, the riot squad, and just descended on the people. We were making a human chain, and if somebody had stepped out of that bus and said, look, there's children here, can we get the children through? by all means, the Roscrea people would let the children through. People were there from Roscrea with their children as well in buggies. There was toddlers there, and they didn't need to see what they've seen either. While I feel sorry for those children that were brought into the hotel, and as a gesture of goodwill for the last couple of days we've been bringing toys, food, clothes into those children. They'll be looked after like all the rest of the refugees and asylum seekers have been looked after in Roscrea in the past. It was just the underhanded way the government went about this, and the way the hotel owners went about it was absolutely atrocious.
The general public are not racist. As is seen by the community in Roscrea, there are legitimate concerns about the management of the refugee crisis. None of these issues are to do with the people arriving into the community. Those who make it about the people arriving into the community co-opt legitimate concerns and morph them into hate. And such is the nature of media and politics that these voices are the ones that are elevated. Why? Because engaging with legitimate concerns highlights the continued and persistent failure of the Irish government, i.e. both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Rory Hearn again.
A lie is being told that immigrants and refugees are the cause of your problems. Immigrants and refugees aren't the cause of the lack of social housing, the lack of GP services, why children with additional needs don't get services. They're caused by governments not investing in these and governments abandoning social housing, abandoning working class areas, working people, and that huge rise in extraction of wealth for those at the top, the billionaires, and this is what is happening. The far right really are tools of the billionaires. That's what they are. They're absolutely doing their bidding. They've no solutions to housing. They've no policy solutions that actually will solve these housing issues. They're not advocating for a massive increase in social housing, for example. Many of them are against social housing. And so there's huge contradictions in what they are saying. They're saying they stand up for people who are being made homeless, for the Irish homeless. I never saw them at the marches in 2016 when Erica Fleming was standing outside the GPO. Where were the patriots then? They weren't there. They're just using housing and homelessness as a way to whip up hate.
Irish politics is at a breaking point. What's clear, however, is that the issues recent immigrants are being blamed for are issues that have been bubbling away for decades. Ireland's not being taken over. Refugees are not the enemy of the people. Claiming that they are will always be a welcome distraction for the political establishment, who can take up newspaper inches and television minutes talking about concerning manifestations of far-right sentiment, be they public beatings of non-white people, or thousands marching the streets against increased immigration. Those in power want you to be fighting over crumbs, rather than questioning the historic and systemic mismanagement of the country. Because the more we argue over the rights of the most vulnerable, the wallets of the wealthiest will continue to bulge. Dara Adelaide again.
Capitalism always ratchets up these crises when there's an endless kind of aim for profit. That's happening with housing, it's happening with healthcare. The amount of foreign investment funds that are investing in private healthcare now here in Ireland, because the public system is failing, right, because of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, it will continue to ratchet up these crises, and at the same time you get layers of people who are completely dehumanised. Back during the crash, I remember it was all across the radio giving out about single parents, how they were scamming the system, or about welfare cheats cheat us all, and now it's the asylum seekers are coming here stealing jobs and taking houses. But there's always a scapegoat, there's always someone at the bottom. And I think if we're going to organise mass anti-government protests, I think we should be marching alongside asylum seekers and immigrants who are victims of this crisis as much as anybody else. I think as long as we're marching against other people down at the bottom, it's kind of letting them away with it. It's letting people who are profiting off these crises completely away with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of it's personal, not even just as a person of colour, although some of it is that these protests happen, the riots happen, even outside of that. I have friends and family here who have to deal with the consequences of when someone keeps peddling these lies about migrants being dangerous, about them taking up resources. There's already anger about the housing crisis, and now that gets directed at people like me, people who look like me. But secondly, I now feel like Irish people in general know what it's like. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Irish people have been immigrants. Loads of my family are living in Canada and Australia. That's both the Nigerian side and the Irish side. I don't think I'm going to accept the same exact arguments that have been used in the past, used against another group. It's history repeating itself. I didn't bail out the banks. I didn't cut pay for nurses and teachers. I didn't cut conditions for Section 39 workers. And I definitely didn't stop building social housing. And all this stuff was decisions made by people. And it's extremely profitable for a small number of individuals and investors, but I don't think that I don't think it lies with immigrants or asylum seekers. And in fact, I don't think it's even immigrants or asylum seekers who are driving the crisis. Every extra pair of hands here is someone else to work. And I think we're all labouring under this illusion that anybody who comes into the country or another person here is some sort of liability, and that's never the case. Every person at the bottom is creating far more and is paying back into the system in terms of taxes, in terms of the labour that they put in that gets extracted as profits by big multinationals, and the money that they send out in rent that gets sent to some investment fund from Germany or the US. The problem, I don't think, is people coming here. I don't think Ireland is full. I think we should be welcoming far more people. I think the problem is on the other end, that when people do come here and they work and they live here, they're paying rent. How much of that is extracted and gone elsewhere? It doesn't pay for schools, doesn't pay for better services. Might be sent to some place in the Cayman Islands, but I think that's the problem. And when you have the Andrew Tates of the world and the Conor McGregors and the Trumps, when they have you at the bottom worrying about asylum seekers, I think something's going wrong.